Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I just wish we had gotten email reminder about it, so I would have more than 30 minutes to prepare my presentation today. But I'd like to talk to you about some of the work I've been doing about agent-based modeling and how I've been using that to model post-earthquake housing recovery. So why do we need this type of modeling to begin with? So the way we deal with disasters and how we plan for them nowadays is very reactive. We're starting making decisions about disasters during that emergency management time. And because of that, there's a lot of pressure to make decisions quite quickly. We are often need to use simple criteria, and we don't have time to evaluate the long-term consequences of those criteria. And because of that, in a lot of cases, we end up with post-disaster decisions that just exacerbate some of the pre-disaster inequalities that we had in our communities. So one of the problems is that whenever we're trying to make decisions for post-disasters, we have to either rely on empirical evidence or experiences from other communities. And the lessons we learn on those other communities may not be transferable to our current community. And another approach is to use computational simulations, but a lot of the computer models we have currently, they have been developed for the use in the insurance industry, and they are not developed for the purpose of post-disaster recovery planning. So my approach to this problem is to use an agent-based approach, and that approach consists of basically 3 steps. The first step is to model the system, understand what's the building inventory, what are the vulnerabilities that we have in that building inventory, and we have to get a lot of data about age, materials, number of stories, and value of each one of those buildings, and that allows us to model that physical vulnerability. The second part is to simulate the disruption to that system. In this case, for example, it's the shake intensity caused by an earthquake. And the third part, which is perhaps the most important, is that evaluated that immediate impact, for example, how many buildings will be damaged and what's the repair cost. And we have to compare those repair costs to the demographics of the population in our community to understand if people are going to have difficulties in recovery. So here is a very complicated figure that I want to walk you through very briefly. So the idea here is that we have some agents in the simulation of recovery. The main agents are in the center, which are the households. Each household occupies a building that may be damaged by the hazard. So if the households have their buildings damaged, they have to seek financing and they are going to procure resources. One of those resources are the contractors. So they interact with those contractors to try to hire a contractor to come to their buildings and perform the repairs that are needed in order for us to reestablish our homes to its pre-disaster state. So the idea is that we can simulate agents with very simple behaviors, but we have multiple of those agents and they interact in ways that creates complexity in that simulation, and that helps us model some of that system. So the idea is that use this model then to create recovery trajectories for a community following an earthquake. So we just assume that each building is occupied by one household, for which we have to associate certain demographics to those households. For example, if they are, what are their income, if they are renters or owners. We also model the process of those households obtaining financing and how they compete to hire those contractors. And at the end of the day, if they're going to be able to repair or if they're going to end up leaving the city. And we do that for multiple scenarios of an earthquake occurrence. Our goal at the end of the day is to help inform the planning for communities such as San Francisco. And one of several studies we have conducted over the last few years, we got some planning insights. For example, 95% of the high-income families would be able to repair their homes within a year after an earthquake in San Francisco. But for the low-income families, that repair time or that recovery process could take as long as 6 years. We also identify, for example, that in San Francisco, there is simply not enough contractors to conduct all the repairs that are needed. And San Francisco is going to have a high influx of contractors coming to the city, and that may have significant impacts to the housing shortages and housing availability after a disaster. And lastly, we also identified that for low-income households, they're 10 times more likely to spend 1 year worth of their income to repair their homes compared to their higher incomes counterparts. And with that, I'll finish it here. Thank you.
So, welcome everyone. My name is Zsarnoczay, and I represent the NAAHDRI Sim Center here. So what I'm going to present is not my work, but it's a work of a bigger team. I want to emphasize that up front. The NAAHDRI Sim Center is an NSF-sponsored 9-year project focusing on computational simulation of natural hazards and their impact. And part of our focus is high-resolution simulation of regional disasters. And what I'm going to talk about today is what we see as opportunities for the engineering community to connect with the social scientists who are working on socioeconomic impact and recovery modeling, or those who are working at the interface, like Rodrigo, who just presented before me. We can do certain improvements to our systems that will help interfacing with these other communities, and then develop high-resolution simulations, including socioeconomic impact and recovery. This is what I'm going to emphasize or highlight in the next few minutes. But before going into those opportunities, I want to first talk about what high-resolution simulations mean. In our opinion, there are two improvements in the recent 10 years that happened to these regional simulations. One of them is increasing the spatial resolution. So going from census tracts that you can see on the left side and aggregating everything in census tracts and evaluating things with a census tract resolution towards mapping every building to a specific location and then dealing with individual buildings and households in those buildings. This offers a lot of opportunities already, but another improvement in the resolution is happening at the methods or the fidelity of the analysis that we are doing for individual buildings. So rather than looking at something at a holistic building level and describing damages, for example, at that level, we are going into a more granular approach where we look at subassemblies or even components in some cases of buildings that provides a much richer description of the damage and will support much richer models and higher fidelity analysis of the consequences of the damage. Now, these are not aspirational goals that we imagine would happen in 5 to 10 years, but there are already examples in the literature and data available that does support these type of calculations, not only from the Sim Center, but there's another example here from the NIST Resilience Center of Excellence. So people can already start to experiment with these regional simulations and then see how they help their research, what kind of additional information they can get by having such high resolution outcomes available. The Sim Center is not developing a new method to support yet another way to calculate these regional simulations, but rather we are bringing together all of the methods that we see in the community and preparing a platform where people can come together and play with the different types of workflows that they can put together from these methods. By a workflow, we mean individual puzzle pieces, as you can see here, that have a certain responsibility for within a calculation, and the data is passed along between these applications until we reach one of the outputs that we are interested in. That could be some performance measure or recovery related measure. What we are doing at the Sim Center is making these transitions seamless by interfacing between these different modules so that you can come and experiment with different workflows. We are not focusing on a specific hazard or on a specific level of resolution, again, to encourage people to experiment with different ways to model these things, and in the process, develop improved approaches to these questions. Now, how does this support socioeconomic analysis and recovery modeling? There are two challenges that we see that we try to address with these platforms. One of them is to develop reproducible and robust simulations. It's very important to have the opportunity and the capability to reproduce a simulation that I read about in the literature. And by having a common platform, this becomes much easier. And that means a social scientist could pick up the results of an engineering study and reproduce the simulation, change certain things that they like, and then bring the results into their own work and run their own models based on that simulation. Another piece of tool that helps with this is a desktop application that we develop that gives you a user interface and walks you through the steps of those workflow and allows you to effortlessly change things. You don't need to learn any coding, or you don't need to know every single detail of those models. The outputs are standardized, so regardless of which workflow you choose, you will always get the same structure of data, again, helping interchanging results and exchanging outputs between different research groups in the community. The other area we see as an important challenge for engineers is to help people collect and augment exposure data. That's not only buildings. I'm showing buildings because that's where we are right now, but we are also looking at demographic data. Helping people collect such data is a big problem. There are silos right now. The data is spread out online. It's very hard to know what is even available publicly. So we are developing tools to help people collect the data, and also developing machine learning based, computer vision based applications that you can see here that help you infer additional characteristics of the buildings or their inhabitants based on what is available in street view images, for example. The last thing I wanted to mention is also helping with data discovery. We are proposing an ontology that the community could use to label the data so that we can find what we are looking for. If everybody would use the common language to talk about this data, it would be much easier to know what is available and to share it between us. So we have the first version here, and we are hoping others would give us feedback and improve this, and then we could adopt something like this as a community. We are a small group, so we would appreciate your feedback, and we are inviting everyone to join us. We have a socioeconomic working group within the Sim Center led by Professor Rachel Davidson. Everybody is welcome to provide comments, provide feedback on what we are doing and how to do better. And there are some other resources that I have here for those who are interested in learning more about the Sim Center. And I flashed this one just because it's recorded, so if anyone wants to see some references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grace Young. Today my name is Wisdom Avusuglo. I'm a postdoc at York University. So today what I'll be talking about is economic incentives and disease modeling. So we are looking at this within individuals' perspective, how behavioral responses by individuals impact prevalence of diseases in communities. So usually what happens is in the event of a disease outbreak, policies are put in place by governmental institutions. So we have health authorities putting in place policy that can help to control the disease outbreak. So these policies in turn affect the disease transmission dynamics. So these policies are in place to control the disease outbreak. So this will affect the disease dynamics and then the disease prevalence. So with this, given the disease prevalence, it then go back and impact the policies again, as we witnessed in the case of COVID-19, where governmental institutions put forth policies that adhere to controlling the disease. And we see how the effect of these policies fed into the existing policies, where there's lockdown, and then if the disease subsides a bit, then there's a relax in these policies. So we see this cyclical effect going on. And also, if there is policies in place, these policies affect behaviors, or individuals respond to these policies, these health policies, which means that we make policies, but individual response to them. And with that, it means that that will also influence the disease transmission. Okay, so we have a case where the policies in place directly impact disease transmission and also indirectly impact the disease transmission through individual responses. So with that, it means that, again, the disease transmission will then impact the disease prevalence, and then that will also go and reinforce the individual responses to these prevalence and the policies in place. And this will also go and also affect the prevailing policies again. So this cycle continues. So it means that it is very important that when we are modeling diseases, we put in place we integrate into the disease modeling framework these interactions going on. So my research investigated the interactive implications of the individuals and governmental institutions, how they respond to disease outbreak within one modeling framework. So what I look at is questions that address the roles of individuals or community compliance with public health policies in attempts of controlling the spread of infectious diseases. And also, by extension, you can also look at the interaction between individuals and individual economic decisions and disease epidemics on general economic activities as well. So with this interaction going on, these affect economic activities in communities. So you want to look at these interact how they impact general economic activities. So for example, if you consider consumption levels, if there's reduction in consumptions or work hours, how does this affect productivity and what have you? So as part of my recent work, I have my current work has addressed the role of community compliance as a way of controlling COVID-19 pandemic. So while I established that when you consider community compliance is very important when it comes to combining that with non-pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical interventions in place. So usually when there is policy out, when health authorities put forth policies, usually they are devoid of how individuals in the community respond to such policies. So here we demonstrated that with policies like that, that is likely not to help combat spread of infectious disease because it is devoid of how individuals react to these policies. So we use COVID-19 as a case to demonstrate this as crucial that when policies are being put in place when it comes to this outbreak, they are contextualized within the population characteristics. So you have to consider economic incentives at work. You have to consider the socioeconomic status of the structure of the population that you are instituting this policy. So with that, as ongoing work or current work, what I'm looking at is looking at the impact of the interplay between the health inequality and behavioral responses on prevalence of COVID-19. So we know that when you consider particular community, there's health inequality that is a challenge in curbing infectious diseases. Now, with another factor, behavioral responses, when these two interact, how do they affect the prevalence of COVID-19? Another direction is to extend this to look at the impact of individual economic decisions and COVID-19 epidemic on the general economic activity. So when you, for example, look at downsizing consumption and work hours, how do that in general affect economic activities and how severe is these interactions? Okay. So these what I've been working on. And with this, I would like to thank the North American Alliance of Hazards and Disaster Research Institute for providing this platform to share my research, and also want to thank the research committee co-chaired by Dr. John Van Linkt and Dr. Jamie Cruz, supported by Dr. Grace Young and other committee members. Also want to thank my co-supervisor, Dr. Ali Asgari, and also want to thank the support from the Africa-Canada Artificial Intelligence and Data Innovation Consortium, the International Development Research Center, and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. Thank you.
Grace, for the introduction. So I recently, just this past week, earned my PhD in the Department of Geography at the University of Utah. And this summer, I'll be transitioning to Arizona State University. So my brief talk is going to focus on environmental justice in the context of flood hazards and some potential future research directions that I am interested in.
Yeah, Aaron, we're seeing a very small picture of your PowerPoint and a very large picture of you.
Oh.
From my from my side, I see it normally. I do see the slide is big.
Same with me.
Okay, so the majority of people see it okay, I think. Is that?
Yeah, so go ahead. I can see it all.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, definitely let me know if something looks off. Okay, so the interest in the distributional environmental injustices that are associated with flooding, they really emerged after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So areas of New Orleans that were heavily damaged by Katrina were disproportionately home to African Americans and people in poverty. So these inequities align with what we would expect in terms of traditional environmental justice patterns, whereby minorities and other socially disadvantaged groups are disproportionately exposed to hazards. So studies that have focused on exposures and impacts in these actual flood events, they've consistently observed these inequities. But other studies that have focused on measures of pre-flood risk, they have not consistently observed those inequities. And so those findings have been really mixed, and they've also entirely almost relied on FEMA's flood zone data, which have been highly criticized by researchers for various reasons, such as being outdated or political maneuvering. So recently released flood hazard modeling generated by Fathom and the First Street Foundation has significantly improved upon FEMA's limitations by integrating very small watershed data, as well as known flood defenses such as levees or dams. They also incorporate changes in the built environment into their modeling, as well as climate change scenarios. And specific information on their modeling can be found in Bates et al. 2021, which was recently published in Water Resources Research. So for my research, I have used FEMA and Fathom's flood risk estimates and asymmetric mapping I basically overlay those data sets to come up with these federally overlooked 100-year flood zones. And my research indicates that nearly 28 million people are living in federally overlooked flood zones in the United States, and that racial and ethnic minorities and low socioeconomic status groups experience disproportionate risk in these federally overlooked flood zones. In this map on the right, it shows the census tract distribution of the counts of people that are living within these 100-year federally overlooked flood zones. And the darkest blue colors are showing the highest counts of people. Another aspect of my research focuses on the differences in flood insurance rates within FEMA versus these federally overlooked flood zones. And the reason for that is because flood insurance has been shown to really enhance recovery after flood events, but it's only required for homeowners that live within 100-year flood zones that were delineated by FEMA. And so this portion of my research suggests that the vast majority of residents in these federally overlooked flood zones have inequitable access to protected flood insurance via the National Flood Insurance Program. In fact, my findings suggest that uninsurance rates are nearly 40% higher in federally overlooked flood zones compared to FEMA flood zones. And so the key point here is that there's a huge lack of protection where flood risk is not fully recognized by the federal government. And so these findings really represent a major public policy dilemma in terms of the national mandates on flood insurance within FEMA's flood zones. And they also represent a really serious environmental justice issue. And so what's needed going forward? So despite the improvements that have been made in flood hazard modeling, our understanding of who's most at risk and who has access to flood insurance, we know a lot less about environmental justice in terms of other investments in structural and non-structural forms of flood protection. For example, my research team at the University of Utah, we conducted some research on Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And what we found was that home structure flood hazard mitigation was protective against home damage. However, these measures were collected from a robust survey that we implemented, and it only focuses on residents in Greater Houston. And so at the national level, one of the few measures that we have of flood protection is flood insurance, which has been shown to enhance recovery, like I mentioned before, but our knowledge about what else people are doing to mitigate flood risk, if they are at all, is really limited. And so we're also limited in our understanding of who's in the most need of certain protection measures. So going forward with my research, I'd be really interested in collaborating with other researchers who have more knowledge about these issues, because this information could be really provide insights that would improve disaster planning and preparedness. And that's it for me. Thank you.
As mentioned, my name is Jesse Gourevitch. I'm a postdoc at the Wharton Risk Center at the University of Pennsylvania and in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UC Davis. And in August, I'll be moving to the Environmental Defense Fund. Today, I'll be giving a brief talk on unpriced climate risk in US housing markets and some of the potential consequences that those risks pose to homeowners and local governments. So as I think many of you know, flooding is expected to increase in frequency and severity under climate change. And this in turn is expected to increase average annual losses to property owners across the US. There's growing concern though that current and future flood risk is not efficiently priced into property values. This is due to many factors, the first of which is that FEMA flood maps are outdated and do not reflect climate risks. Second, national flood insurance prices are heavily subsidized for many properties, therefore sending distorted price signals to flood zone property owners. And third, in many states, sellers are not required to disclose a property's flood risk to a potential buyer. This results in potential buyers, in many cases, having no idea that a property is actually exposed to flood risk. So together, these issues lead to concern that many properties that are exposed to flood risk are in fact overvalued, that their prices do not reflect flood risk. So the overarching objective of this analysis is to look at the magnitude and distribution of overvaluation across the US. So first, I estimate the empirical effects of flood risk on property sale prices. Second, I use best available information on average annual losses to individual properties to estimate what I call the efficient price of flood zone properties. Third, I calculate potential overvaluation, essentially is the difference between the empirical price and the efficient price for a property. And then I look at the distribution of overvaluation by income and race across the US. And then lastly, identify municipalities that are most vulnerable to losing tax revenue if overvaluation becomes realized and price deflation occurs. So across counties in the US, I find that properties within the flood zone are discounted by about 2.5% to 9.5%, depending on state level flood risk disclosure requirements and perceptions of climate risk. So now moving on to some of the results of overvaluation at the county level. So looking at the median overvaluation of properties exposed to flood risk, in some counties, particularly in Appalachia and in northern New England, median overvaluation of these properties is in some cases greater than 30% of their value. Looking at total overvaluation in dollar terms of properties exposed to flood risk, I estimate that total value is approximately $187 billion under a 3% discount rate. this overvaluation is concentrated in counties along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, as well as along the California coasts, where there's a high degree of flood risk and also very high property values. This figure indicates that overvaluation is most widespread in lower income census tracts. And that's true across all levels of overvaluation as a percentage of property value. This trend similarly holds across racial characteristics, where we see that at lower levels of overvaluation, census tracts with a lower percentage of the population white have more overvalued properties. However, that trend flips when we look at properties that are heavily overvalued in terms of that 50 to 100% of their value. So the implication of this is that if price deflation were to occur, it is in general lower income and non-white populations that would be disproportionately affected by this loss of home equity. And for many households, their home is their most valuable asset. So that definitely threatens to exacerbate racial wealth gaps in the US. Here I look at the intersection of property overvaluation as a proportion of total property value in a country. So that's indicated in these purple hues, and counties where property tax revenue is a large percentage of their overall total revenue. So it's the overlap of these two variables indicated in black that indicates local governments that are most vulnerable to budgetary shortfalls in the event of price deflation, if that were to occur. So then the big question is, what will happen in terms of overvaluation and price deflation? And the answer to that is complex. It really depends on interacting responses by property owners, public institutions, particularly the NFIP, and private sector businesses, particularly mortgage lenders, and how these entities respond to increasing climate risk will essentially create the outcome of whether these costs are increasingly socialized by the American public or whether internalized by flood zone property owners. And in that latter case, that will really dictate the time period over which price deflation occurs. Thank you.